The Oldchurch and District Historical Society did not so much meet as it congealed. Its members, drawn from the more resilient strata of Flaxborough's social geology, gathered for their annual summer lecture in the Abbey refectory, a place that managed to smell of damp stone, floor polish, and the faint, persistent ghost of boiled cabbage. The air was thick with the polite rustle of pamphlets and the small, dry coughs of those for whom an hour's uninterrupted sitting was a significant athletic endeavour. Presiding over this solemn assembly was Mrs. Eugenia Tiller, a woman whose posture suggested she had been bolted upright to her chair. As the Society's chairwoman, she viewed local history not as a subject for gentle inquiry, but as a territory to be defended against the incursions of inaccuracy, poor taste, and the modern world in general. The evening's speaker was Mr. Alistair Finch, the local archivist, a man who seemed to be held together by tweed and anxiety. His chosen topic was the ecclesiastical glazing of medieval Oldchurch, a study in pigment and piety. He was, at this moment, navigating the treacherous waters of 14th-century manganese dioxide usage, his voice a low, nervous drone that served as a perfect accompaniment to the gentle nodding of heads in the audience. Among the nodders were Canon Throop, a man whose spiritual devotion was rivalled only by his appreciation for a well-made Battenberg cake, and Major Eustace Pym, who attended these events primarily to confirm his suspicion that everything had been done better a century ago. And so, Mr. Finch quavered, gesturing with a trembling hand towards the projection screen, we come to the jewel in Oldchurch's crown, the Veil of St. Agnes. On the screen, a slide clicked into place, showing the magnificent stained glass window that graced the far wall of the refectory itself. It was a masterpiece of shimmering blues and blood reds, depicting a serene-faced saint gazing heavenward, her expression one of beatific fortitude. Notice, Mr. Finch continued, his confidence growing slightly as he entered familiar territory, the sublime tranquillity of the saint's visage, a testament to the artisan's skill in capturing not just an image, but an essence. It was at that precise, reverence-soaked moment that the sound came. It was not a bang nor a crash. It was a sharp, resonant crack, the sound of something ancient and brittle giving way. It was a sound so entirely out of place in the muffled quiet of the refectory that for a full second nobody moved. It was as if a line of improper dialogue had been uttered in church. A collective intake of breath, like a reverse sigh, rippled through the room. Then a cold, unscripted breeze snaked its way through the hall, fluttering the lecture notes on Mr. Finch's lectern and chilling the back of Canon Throop's neck. All heads, as if pulled by a single string, turned from the projected image on the screen to the real thing at the end of the hall. There, in the magnificent Veil of St. Agnes, was a jagged, star-shaped fracture. Its epicenter was the saint's serene face, which was now a spiderweb of splintered blue and white glass, with a dark, gaping hole where her beatific smile had been. The slide on the screen and the reality on the wall were now dreadful twins. Flaxborough did not do panic. It did, however, excel at a kind of flustered corporate indignation. Good heavens!
An outrage!
My dear, did you hear? Mrs. Tiller rose to her feet, her expression one of deep, personal injury.
Silence, please.
There is no need for alarm. Her voice could have frozen hot tea. Hooligans, Major Pym declared to no one in particular.
Mark my words. An air rifle, I'd wager. No respect. Mr. Finch, his lecture utterly derailed, simply stared, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish.
The delicate narrative of his manganese dioxide had been brutally shattered. The police was summoned. The arrival of Inspector Pubright and Sergeant Love was, as always, an exercise in quietude. They did not burst in. They entered, their presence settling over the room like a fine layer of dust. Pubright was a man of medium height, medium build, and a profoundly thoughtful stillness. He surveyed the scene, the agitated members, the shattered glass glinting on the stone floor, the plate of untouched lemon drizzle cake on the refreshment table. Sergeant Love, notebook at the ready, began the usual preliminary questions. But Pubright walked slowly towards the lectern, his gaze moving from the violated window to the pale, trembling archivist. He picked up one of the fallen pages of Mr. Finch's lecture. He didn't ask about intruders or weapons. His first question, posed with an air of mild academic curiosity, was directed at the lecturer. "A most unfortunate coincidence, Mr. Finch," Pubright said, his voice calm and even. "You were just discussing this very window, I believe." "Just as it broke." Mr. Finch could only nod, his throat too tight for words. Pubright looked from the shattered glass to the equally shattered composure of the Oldchurch and District Historical Society. A faint, almost imperceptible expression of interest flickered across his face. The crime was not merely the breaking of a window. It was a crack in the town's complacency, and through that crack a cold breeze was now blowing. By the time Sergeant Love had finished taking down the names of the 37 attendees, the shock in the Abbey refectory had curdled into a more durable substance. Opinion. An event of this nature was, for Flaxborough, not so much a crime as a social catalyst, an unexpected ingredient dropped into the town's slow-simmering stew of resentments and alliances. Information, or what passed for it, escaped the Abbey's cold walls with the speed of a released secret. Major Pym, his duty as a witness discharged with military briskness, made directly for the grapes. He considered it his civic responsibility to disseminate a correct, authoritative version of events before rumour could mangle it. Pushing open the saloon bar door, he found the usual evening assembly contemplating their pints. "An act of calculated vandalism," he announced, placing himself squarely in the centre of the room. "At the Historical Society. Some blackguard with a catapult, I shouldn't wonder, smashed the St. Agnes window clean through." Mr. Worsfold, the landlord, paused in the polishing of a glass, his expression one of professional melancholy. "Dreadful, Major. A piece of history, that was. Will you be having your usual?"
"Of course," the Major grunted, taking a seat.
Point is, it was timed to the second, just as that fellow Finch was talking about it. "A direct assault on our heritage."
"It's the thin end of the wedge." A man nursing a mild and bitter at the corner table, a Mr. Gosling who repaired lawnmowers with more pessimism than skill, looked up.
"More likely some lad who'd had a pint too many, Major. Or maybe it's the council. They've had their eye on the Abbey grounds for a car park since 1978. This was a more satisfying theory. It had depth. It had motive. The idea of a lone hooligan was simply an act of chaos, but the notion of a conspiracy by the Flaxborough District Council, that was a narrative one could get one's teeth into. The conversation turned immediately to Councillor Pawson and his long-held belief that progress was best measured in square feet of tarmac. Meanwhile, a different strain of the story was taking root in the genteel atmosphere of the Chalet Café. Here, Miss Irene Trimble, who had been sitting 3 rows behind the Major, was giving her account to the café's proprietor, Miss Padma, and a captive audience of 2 ladies enjoying Earl Grey. It was the timing of it.
"My dear," Miss Trimble whispered, her voice thrilling with remembered trauma.
Poor Alistair Finch was just reaching his peroration. The light on the screen, the window behind.
And then crack.
He went as white as a sheet.
"I thought he was going to have one of his turns, Miss Padma."
A woman whose quiet demeanour concealed a mind as intricately indexed as a library's card catalogue, listened intently while refilling a sugar bowl. "And Mrs. Tiller?" she prompted gently.
"How did she take it?"
"Oh, Eugenia," Miss Trimble sighed. "You know her?" She rose to the occasion. You'd have thought it was her own drawing-room window. She was speaking to that nice Inspector Pubright as if he were a tradesman who'd tracked mud on her carpet. The talk in the chalet did not linger on catapults or car parks. It settled on more fertile ground, personalities.
Alistair Finch's delicate nerves.
Canon Throop's perceived inability to stand up to a personality as formidable as Eugenia Tiller's, and Mrs. Tiller herself, whose custodianship of the town's history was seen by some as less of a service and more of a hostile takeover.
Had someone sought to wound her through the window she prized above all else?
The motive was no longer vandalism, but a subtle and vicious personal slight. Back at the station, the official report lay on Inspector Purbright's desk. It was a document of profound simplicity. Item 1, broken 14th century stained glass window. Item 2, 1, small irregularly shaped stone, likely granite, found on the refectory floor beneath the point of impact. Item 3, 37 witnesses, none of whom saw anything. Sergeant Love entered, his notebook full of the town's burgeoning theories. "The Major's convinced it's an anarchist with a catapult, sir," he reported dutifully. "Down at the Grapes, the talk is it's Councillor Pawson clearing the way for development, and Miss Trimble's circle seems to think it's a personal attack on Mrs. Tiller." Purbright looked up from the report. He had not moved for some time, his gaze fixed on the small plastic bag containing the granite stone. It was a thoroughly ordinary stone, the kind one might find in any garden or country lane.
"A personal attack, Love?"
he mused, his tone mild. "That's the most interesting of the three, sir." "Anarchists are noisy," Purbright explained, as if discussing the weather. "And councils are bureaucratic. They use planning permissions and compulsory purchase orders, not pebbles in the dark. But a personal slight, a grievance nursed long enough to be aimed with such precision," he paused, tapping a finger on his desk. "That requires a certain amount of thought. It requires a motive more complex than mere destruction." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet, darkening streets of Flaxborough. The news was still travelling, weaving its gossamer web from house to house, from pub to post office, altering its shape with every telling. Purbright knew that somewhere in that web, tangled amongst the speculation and the slander, a single, strong thread of truth was waiting to be found. The trick was not to tear the web while looking for it. The following morning, Flaxborough awoke to a day of crisp, unassuming sunshine, as if to distance itself from the previous night's theatricality. Inspector Purbright, however, felt that a little theatre was precisely what the investigation required. The small granite stone sat catalogued on his desk, but it was a silent, uncooperative witness. The people, he mused, were always more forthcoming, especially when they believed they were talking about something else entirely. His first call was to the residence of Mrs. Eugenia Tiller. Her house, a severe red-brick villa named The Laurels, stood guard over its patch of lawn with a proprietary air that perfectly mirrored its owner. Mrs. Tiller received him not in a comfortable sitting room, but in the hall, a cold, formal space designed for the brief containment of unwelcome visitors. "I trust you are making progress." "Inspector," she began, foregoing any preamble. "An act of such barbarism cannot be allowed to go unpunished. It is an attack on the very fabric of this town." "The fabric is often more resilient than it appears, Mrs. Tiller," Purbright said mildly. "I was hoping you might assist me. You are, I believe, the town's foremost authority on the Abbey's treasures." A flicker of stern satisfaction crossed her face. "I've dedicated 27 years to the society. Someone must maintain standards. The Veil of St. Agnes was, you understand, priceless. Not merely in monetary terms, though its insurance valuation is, of course, considerable." "Of course," Purbright murmured. "Was there any recent discussion about that valuation? Or about the window's security?" "The canon is always concerned about cost," she said, a hint of acid in her tone. "He sees the Abbey's contents as a spiritual trust, which is all well and good, but he lacks a certain
pragmatism.
He would have the doors wide open day and night if he could. I am the one who must insist on locks, on humidity controls, on the practicalities of preservation. A necessary burden, Pubright sympathized. Were there any other items of particular value in the refectory? The entire collection is valuable, she corrected him. There is the 16th century lectern, the charter chest, and the Oglethorpe trowel, of course, presented to the town in 1894.
Solid silver.
It was in the display case by the west wall. She spoke of these objects as a mother might speak of her children, each one precious and vulnerable. And you can think of no one who might bear a grudge against the society, perhaps, or the Abbey itself? Mrs. Tiller's list of candidates was extensive and varied. It included, in no particular order, the town council, levellers, the lot of them, a rival historical society in a neighbouring town, amateurs with delusions of grandeur, and a young man who had once been reprimanded for leaning on a 15th century sarcophagus. She presented these possibilities with the unshakable conviction of a zealot. Pubright listened to it all with serene patience, making few notes. He knew that what was said was often less important than what was omitted. His next visit was to the Abbey itself. He found Canon Throop in his study, a warm, book-filled room that smelled of old paper and Earl Grey tea. The Canon's distress was of a quieter, more profound sort than Mrs. Tiller's strident indignation. "It feels like a wound, Inspector," he said, looking out towards the now boarded window. "A senseless act, to deface something so beautiful." "Senseless acts are often the most difficult to investigate," Pubright replied, accepting a cup of tea. "Mrs. Tiller seems to feel the society was the target." The Canon sighed, a gentle, weary sound. "Eugenia is a formidable woman. Her dedication to the society is absolute. She feels a profound sense of ownership over the Abbey's history. Sometimes, I confess, it feels as though the church is merely the building in which her collection is housed." The admission was made with a sad smile, the closest a man of his gentle nature could come to open complaint. "Ownership can be a contentious thing," Pubright prompted. "Indeed, the society is the legal custodian of many of the historical artifacts, you see, a situation dating back to a bequest in the 1930s. The church provides the space. It is a partnership that requires delicate navigation. Have you had to navigate any particular delicacies recently, Canon?" The clergyman hesitated, stirring his tea with unnecessary concentration. "There are always small matters. Eugenia was most opposed to my suggestion that we loan the Oglethorpe trowel to the county museum for their Civic Treasures exhibition. She felt its place was here, in Oldchurch. She can be very protective, I see." Pubright took a slow sip of his tea. The picture was becoming clearer. It was not a simple case of a church and a historical society.
It was a monarchy with Eugenia Tiller on the throne and the gentle Canon as the leader of a very loyal, very quiet opposition. "And Mr. Finch?"
Pubright asked, changing the subject slightly. "The lecturer. He must have been very distressed, poor Alistair," the Canon said with genuine pity. "He is a sensitive soul. He reveres Mrs. Tiller, you know. He has been her protégé at the archives for years. For this to happen during his lecture, he will have taken it as a personal failure." Pubright left the Abbey a short while later, walking slowly across the sun-dappled churchyard. He had started the day with a single, meaningless stone. He now had two powerful and opposing forces, a disputed piece of silverware and a nervous archivist caught in the middle. The crack in the veil of St. Agnes was beginning to look less like an act of random vandalism and more like a carefully aimed shot in a very quiet, very civilized war. In any police investigation, there comes a point where the untidy reality of a crime meets the irresistible urge for a tidy solution. In Flaxborough, this point usually arrived in the office of Chief Constable Chubley, a man who believed that the primary function of the law was to avoid causing a fuss. He had summoned Pubright to a meeting which also included Councillor Pawson, a man whose presence ensured that the interests of civic order and the council's reputation were adequately represented. Right then, Pubright, Chubley began, with the air of a man already late for his lunch. This business at the Abbey, an unpleasant affair. Bad for tourism. Bad for morale. Pawson here is understandably concerned.
What have we got?
Pubright did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured to a young, eager police constable named Ormside, who stood stiffly by the wall. P.C. Ormside had been tasked with making local inquiries, a job he had approached with the breathless enthusiasm of a dog retrieving a stick. P.C. Ormside has a preliminary report.
Sir, Pubright said. Ormside cleared his throat.
Sir, following house-to-house inquiries, a witness, Mrs. Gable of 14 Abbey Close, reports seeing a youth acting suspiciously near the churchyard wall at approximately 7:30 p.m. on the night in question. She identified the youth as Kevin Higgins. A name hung in the air, ripe with possibility. Kevin Higgins was Flaxborough's standing nominee for the role of culprit in any crime that lacked a more obvious candidate. His catalogue of misdeeds was long but not, Pubright had always noted, particularly ambitious, riding his bicycle on the pavement, a brief and unsuccessful flirtation with graffiti, and a singular charge of disturbing the peace by playing a transistor radio too loudly in the vicinity of the public library. Higgins, Chubley repeated, the name itself seeming to offer a solution.
Figures. Furthermore, sir, Ormside pressed on, sensing victory, acting on that information, we obtained permission to search the garden shed at the Higgins residence.
We found this. He produced a small, Y-shaped twig with a piece of elastic attached. It was, unmistakably, a catapult. Councillor Pawson exhaled slowly, a sound of profound relief. Well, there you are. An open and shut case.
A young lout with a weapon and a lack of respect for property. It's neat, I'll grant you, Chubley said, nodding approvingly at Pubright.
No motive to worry about beyond youthful idiocy. Bring the boy in, get a statement, and we can have it all cleared up by tea time. The Flaxborough Chronicle will want a comment about our swift and effective action. Pubright, who had remained silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. His tone was one of mild academic inquiry. The stone found inside the refectory was a piece of granite, Chief Constable. P.C. Ormside, what sort of ammunition did you find near the catapult?
Ormside blinked.
A small pile of pebbles, sir. Limestone mostly. From the rockery. Limestone, Pubright repeated softly. He let the words sit in the air for a moment. And the timing. Mrs. Gable saw him at 7:30. Mr. Finch's lecture began at 8, and the window was broken at approximately 8:45. It's a long time to be waiting in a churchyard on a chilly evening, just to break a window. Chubley waved a dismissive hand. Details, Pubright. He probably went for a wander and came back. Lads like that have no sense of time. The point is, we have a known troublemaker, a weapon, and a witness. It's a solid case. It's the sort of case that makes sense. Councillor Pawson nodded vigorously.
Exactly.
It sends the right message. We will not tolerate this kind of hooliganism in Flaxborough, Pubright did not argue. He had learned long ago that one could not deflect a bureaucracy from its chosen path of least resistance. One simply had to wait for it to run into a wall. Very well, sir. We'll have him brought in for questioning. He and Sergeant Love left the meeting a few minutes later and walked out into the pale afternoon light. Well, that was quick, Love remarked, with a note of satisfaction. Nice to have one wrapped up so easily. Pubright stopped and looked back at the solid, imposing facade of the town hall. An easy solution is often a great comfort, Love, he said. It tidies things away. It allows everyone to get back to their business. And you don't think he did it? The inspector resumed walking, his pace unhurried. Oh, I think Kevin Higgins is perfectly capable of being a nuisance. It's one of his few reliable talents. But this crime...
This had precision.
It had a certain wit. It was, if you'll forgive the term, well aimed. And I find it difficult to picture young Kevin as a student of wit, irony, or ecclesiastical architecture, while Sergeant Love was engaged in the thankless task of interviewing Kevin Higgins, an exchange that produced little more than a series of monosyllabic grunts and a
vague alibi involving a television
program of which the boy could recall neither the plot nor the title. Inspector Pubright found himself drawn back to the
scene of the crime.
He felt the official investigation was generating more heat than light, and he had always preferred a cooler, more ambient illumination. He returned to the Abbey refectory. The air of flustered indignation had evaporated, leaving behind the building's customary scent of cold stone and faith. A verger, a stooped man named Bellows, was sweeping the last glittering shards of 14th-century glass into a dustpan with funereal reverence. Pubright gave him a quiet nod and, ignoring the great boarded-up wound in the far wall, walked purposefully towards a glass-topped display case that stood against the west wall. It was a fine piece of Victorian cabinetry, dark wood and polished brass, its contents intended to be admired but not touched. Inside, resting on a bed of faded burgundy velvet, lay a collection of civic memorabilia, a leather-bound book of charters, a set of commemorative medals, and an empty depression. Pubright stared at the depression. It was the precise shape and size of a ceremonial trowel. He recalled both Mrs. Tiller's and Canon Throop's words. The Oglethorpe trowel, solid silver. He peered closer at the cabinet's lock. It was a simple but sturdy brass mechanism, currently in the locked position. There were no scratches around it, no splinters of wood to suggest it had been forced. "Excuse me, Mr. Bellows," Pubright said, his voice barely disturbing the quiet. The verger shuffled over. "Inspector, a terrible business. A piece of history gone in a flash." "Indeed," Pubright agreed.
This display case.
"You're the one who looks after it, I imagine."
That's right.
"Have done for 30 years. Polish the glass every Tuesday, regular as clockwork. And you polished it this week?" "Tuesday morning, just gone." "The day of the lecture," Mr. Bellows confirmed.
Gave the silver a bit of a buff while I was at it.
"That trowel came up a treat, so it was certainly here on the morning of the incident," Pubright mused. He looked again at the empty space on the velvet.
Has anyone else mentioned it?
Mr. Bellows looked puzzled.
"Mention what, Inspector?"
"That the trowel is missing." The verger squinted into the case, his brow furrowing. "Well, I'll be—" "You're right.
It's gone. How on earth?"
"Mrs. Tiller will be beside herself. She keeps the only key." This, Pubright thought, was the most curious detail of all. Mrs. Tiller, a woman for whom every artifact was a sacred trust, had catalogued every possible suspect for the window's destruction, yet had failed to notice the disappearance of a solid silver trowel from under her very nose.
A vandal who throws a stone is a simple creature.
But a thief who can remove an object from a locked case to which only one person has the key, and do so without leaving a trace, belonged to a different species altogether. The two crimes felt like they had been committed on different planets, let alone in the same room on the same evening. He thanked the verger and left the Abbey, stepping out into the quiet churchyard. The official theory, Kevin Higgins and his catapult, seemed more threadbare than ever. A boy like that would have smashed the case, grabbed the shiniest object, and run. This was an act of surgical precision. It was a magic trick. The name Oglethorpe echoed in his mind. He was sure he had encountered it before, not in a police report, but in the dense, opinionated columns of the Flaxborough Chronicle's letters page. It had been years ago, a tiresome and convoluted dispute about the terms of a historical bequest, a small-town squabble forgotten by almost everyone. Almost. He walked past the police station, leaving the matter of Kevin Higgins to run its neat and tidy course. His own path was now leading elsewhere, away from the obvious damage and towards the subtle void. The shattered window was a shout, designed to draw everyone's attention. But the missing trowel, he suspected, was a whisper, and Pubright had always found whispers to be infinitely more informative. The Flaxborough Lending Library was less a building and more a state of mind. It operated under the strict but benevolent rule of Miss Lucinda Jessup, a woman who believed that a correctly dated return slip was a small but vital contribution to the order of the universe. Silence was not merely encouraged, it was curated. It was to this hushed sanctuary that Inspector Pubright came in search of a forgotten argument. Miss Jessup greeted him with a look of professional inquiry over the top of her spectacles. Police visits were rare and usually concerned overdue books, a matter she considered far more serious than petty crime. "Inspector?" she said, her voice a carefully modulated whisper. "How may we help you, Miss Jessup?" "I was hoping to consult your archives, the Flaxborough Chronicle, specifically. I'm interested in the letters section from around 5 years ago." "An unedifying period for public discourse, as I recall," she commented, already moving with quiet efficiency towards a back room. "There was a particularly tedious debate about parking permits. But the volumes are all in order." She returned with a heavy, dust-scented book, placing it on a large oak table. Pubright sat and began to turn the brittle, yellowing pages. The library was quiet, the only sounds being the gentle rustle of newsprint and the authoritative thump of Miss Jessup's date stamp. "A sad business at the Abbey," Pubright remarked to the room at large, his eyes still scanning the columns. "I imagine the Historical Society members are your most frequent visitors." "They are a constant presence," Miss Jessup confirmed, appearing at his elbow to shelve a book with unnerving stealth. "History is a demanding subject. It requires a great deal of looking things up, indeed. I suppose Mr. Finch, the archivist, practically lives here." "Mr. Finch has been a most diligent researcher these past few weeks," she said, a hint of something curiosity,
Mild disapproval,
in her tone. "His interests have become rather specific." Pubright looked up from the paper, his expression one of polite, passive interest. "Oh?" He borrowed several monographs on medieval construction techniques, one on ecclesiastical architecture, which was to be expected for his lecture, but also a rather technical volume on counterweight siege engines, published by a university press.
very dense.
Full of diagrams. Miss Jessup delivered this information as a simple statement of fact, but her librarian's soul was clearly perplexed by the archivist's sudden swerve from stained glass to military engineering. "How fascinating," Pubright murmured. "A man of wide-ranging interests." "His are not the only interests to have taken a peculiar turn," she continued, warming to her theme. The library was her ledger, and she knew every entry. Ms. Tiller, for instance. One would not associate her with the finer points of trust law, and yet, not a month ago, she requested access to our legal reference texts. She was most absorbed in the section on the Cypre doctrine. The what? It concerns the alteration of the terms of a charitable trust when the original purpose becomes impossible or impractical to fulfill, Miss Jessup explained neatly. "A very specific niche of the law." Pubright felt a familiar, quiet click in his mind, the sound of two disparate facts connecting. A legal doctrine concerning bequests and a self-appointed guardian of a collection built on one. He turned a page in the Chronicle, and there it was, a headline on the letters page. "The Oglethorpe bequest, a question of trust." He quickly read the chain of correspondence. It began with a letter from a man named Jonathan Oglethorpe, identifying himself as the great-nephew of the original benefactor. He claimed the Historical Society was not fulfilling the bequest's terms, which stipulated the collection be used for the education and edification of the common man, and argued that it had become the private preserve of an elite committee. He politely suggested the collection should revert to the family. This was followed by a blistering 2-column rebuttal from Eugenia Tiller, quoting the Society's charter and defending its custodianship with the ferocity of a dragon guarding its hoard. "Even Major Pym has been pursuing a new hobby," Miss Jessup added, interrupting his thoughts. "He spent an entire afternoon studying 19th century ordnance survey maps of the Abbey and the surrounding land. He seemed most interested in property lines and rights of way." Pubright closed the heavy volume. He now had a lecturer studying catapults, a society chairwoman researching how to alter a trust, and a retired major examining ancient maps of the very ground from which a projectile might have been launched. The official theory of Kevin Higgins and his random act of vandalism now seemed not just unlikely, but insultingly simple-minded. This was not a crime of impulse. It was a crime of research. It had been planned in the quiet aisles of this very library. The shattering of the veil of St. Agnes was not a beginning. It was a conclusion, a final, emphatic sentence at the end of a long and meticulously footnoted argument. "Thank you, Miss Jessup," Pubright said, rising to his feet. "You've been most helpful."
"As always. The library exists to provide information, Inspector," she replied.
"What people choose to do with it is, thankfully, outside my jurisdiction." The case against Kevin Higgins dissolved as Pubright knew it would, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Under the prolonged, if gentle, pressure of Sergeant Love's questioning, the boy's alibi solidified into something resembling fact. A neighbour recalled seeing him indoors at the crucial time, his face illuminated by the flickering blue light of the television. Chief Constable Chubley accepted the news with a grunt of displeasure, his neat and tidy solution having come untidied all over his desk. Flaxborough was once again left without a villain, a state of affairs that made the town profoundly uncomfortable. It was 2 evenings later that the second blow fell, this one aimed not at the Abbey's history, but at its voice. Thursday was choir practice, an event as fixed in the town's weekly calendar as the delivery of milk. The Abbey's choir, under the precise direction of Mr. Cecil Pringle, was rehearsing a particularly intricate piece of Tudor polyphony. Mr. Pringle, the organist and choirmaster, was a man who treated harmony not as a pleasant arrangement of notes, but as a moral imperative. He sat at the great organ console, a magnificent beast of polished oak and ivory keys, his entire being focused on coaxing from it a sound that was both divine and, more importantly, correct. Canon Throop was in his customary pew, eyes closed in serene appreciation. The choir navigated a difficult passage, their voices weaving together in a delicate tapestry of sound. They were approaching the final glorious chord, a moment of swelling resolution designed to lift the spirit and rattle the collection plates. Mr. Pringle drew a deep, preparatory breath. His hands descended, his feet settled on the pedals. He pressed. The sound that erupted from the organ was not of this earth. It was a monstrous, soul-shaking bellow, a chord of pure, weaponized discord. It was the sound of a dozen celestial brass bands all falling down a spiral staircase at once. A deep, shuddering groan from the largest pipes was overlaid with a high-pitched, screaming shriek from the smallest, the whole unholy concoction bound together by a note of such profound and offensive wrongness that it seemed to tear a hole in the sacred air. The choir stopped, their mouths open, their harmonies instantly annihilated. A soprano gave a small, terrified squeak. Canon Throop's eyes shot open, his expression one of a man who had just witnessed a breach of heavenly protocol. Mr. Pringle had sprung back from the console as if it had given him an electric shock, his face ashen with horror. The cipher.
"A catastrophic cipher,"
he stammered, staring at the keys.
"The great principle. Something's jammed."
For a man like Cecil Pringle, this was not a mechanical fault. It was a deeply personal attack, a theological crisis expressed through malfunctioning pneumatics. After a period of flustered discussion, and with the help of Mr. Bellows the verger and a very long torch, a cautious exploration of the organ's majestic inner workings was undertaken. It was Mr. Bellows who found it. There, wedged with surgical precision into the delicate mechanism that controlled the airflow to the great principle, the very backbone of the organ's sound, was a small grey stone. It was an ordinary piece of granite, almost identical to the one that now sat in an evidence bag on Purbright's desk. When Inspector Pubright arrived, the atmosphere in the Abbey was thick with a sense of violation far deeper than that caused by the broken window. The window had been an attack on the past. This felt like an attack on the present, on the living, breathing ritual of the church. He examined the stone where it lay on the verger's handkerchief. It was not dropped or thrown, it had been placed. To get to that particular spot required a knowledge of the organ's layout, a key to the organ loft, and a moment when no one was watching. This, I think, Pubright said quietly to Sergeant Love, who was dutifully taking notes, conclusively ends the Kevin Higgins chapter of our story.
I doubt he could even find the organ loft, let alone perform this kind of delicate sabotage. It's an insider then, sir, Love stated, the conclusion now unavoidable.
Someone who knows this place. Someone who knows it intimately, Pubright corrected him. Someone who knows how to make it speak and how to make it scream. This wasn't about breaking the organ, Love. It was about making it play a very specific, very ugly tune. He stood for a moment in the centre of the nave, the choir members now huddled in a corner, speaking in shocked whispers. The first act had been a spectacle, a shattering of glass for all the town to see. This second act was quieter, more technical, its audience limited to the few who participated in the Abbey's inner life. It was a message delivered with startling precision. The window had been a challenge to the custodians of the Abbey's history. The organ, he suspected, was a warning to its spiritual guardians. The quiet, civilized war he had detected was escalating. Inspector Pubright sat in his office long after the rest of the station had gone quiet. On his desk, 2 small grey granite stones lay in separate evidence bags. They were, in and of themselves, entirely unremarkable, and yet they were the punctuation marks in a statement he was only just beginning to understand. The official investigation had reached a dead end, a place of shrugged shoulders and unanswered questions. But Purbright's own inquiry was leading him away from the solid ground of evidence and into the much murkier territory of human nature. He was not, he reflected, dealing with criminals. Criminals were, for the most part, predictable creatures, their motives, greed, anger, jealousy, as old and as plain as the stones on his desk. He was dealing with something far more complex, respectable people. And respectable people, when they decided to break the rules, did so with a subtlety and a flair for invention that the average burglar could never hope to match. He considered his small cast of characters, not as suspects but as monuments to their own lives. There was Mrs. Eugenia Tiller, a woman who had built her reputation as the unassailable guardian of Flaxborough's past. She was not merely the chairwoman of the Historical Society. She was the Historical Society. Her identity was so completely fused with the collection in her care that she likely viewed the Abbey's artefacts with a sense of ownership that bordered on the feudal. An attack on the Veil of St. Agnes was, to her, a personal insult of the highest order. But what if she perceived a different threat, a legal challenge to her authority, like the one from the Oglethorpe descendant? Her research into trust law suggested a woman preparing for battle. Could these acts of vandalism be a bizarre, scorched earth defense of her territory, a way of saying that if she could not have sole, undisputed control, then no one could?
Then there was Canon Throop,
a man whose public face was one of gentle piety and quiet forbearance. Yet Pubright knew that true gentleness was not weakness. It was often a form of contained strength. For years, the canon had ministered in a building where the most precious contents were legally controlled by an indomitable laywoman. How much frustration must have simmered beneath that placid surface? A man of God could not engage in public squabbles or legal wrangling. It would be unseemly. But could he, in a moment of profound exasperation, resort to symbolic acts? An attack on the window curated by Mrs. Tiller, followed by an assault on the organ, the very voice of his own ministry. It had a certain dreadful symmetry. It was the logic of a man who felt he was fighting for the soul of his church. And what of the nervous Mr. Finch, the loyal apprentice, the diligent archivist? Pubright thought of him not as a leader, but perhaps as a weapon, a tool wielded by a stronger will. His research into medieval siege engines was the most jarring note in the entire affair. Was he merely following Mrs. Tiller's orders, gathering the technical knowledge for a plan she had devised? Or was there, beneath the timid exterior, a different man entirely? A man, perhaps, suffocated by his mentor's dominance, who had planned this affair as a twisted sort of homage, a lecture demonstration that had spiraled into reality. Finally, there was Major Pym, a man whose entire existence was a protest against the declining standards of the modern world. His life was a performance of old-fashioned integrity, a rigid adherence to a code that existed mostly in his own mind. Such men, Pubright reflected, often nursed a deep-seated belief that they alone knew what was right. His research into old maps and property lines was specific, the work of a man planning a campaign. Was it possible that he saw some historical injustice, some violation of an ancient right-of-way or boundary that only he was principled enough to correct, even if it meant using a catapult? Each of them was imprisoned by their own reputation. They were the custodian, the vicar, the scholar, the soldier. They could not simply voice a grievance or file a lawsuit. To do so would be to admit fallibility, to crack the polished surface of their public selves. And so their passions, their resentments, their sense of justice had been channeled into this strange, theatrical crime. The motive was not destruction. The motive was reputation, the desperate, crushing weight of it, and the extraordinary things a person would do to either preserve it or escape from it. Pubright picked up one of the evidence bags.
A simple stone?
A tool for a simple mind, but in the right hands, aimed with the precision of a long-nursed grievance, it had become a key, unlocking a whole cabinet of carefully guarded secrets. He had thought enough. It was time to insert another key, a polite question, and see which door it would open. Inspector Pubright believed that the most revealing conversations often took place under the most boring of pretexts. He therefore arranged a meeting in a small, airless committee room at the town hall, a space panelled in dark, funereal wood that seemed to absorb all sound and optimism. The stated purpose was to conduct a multi-stakeholder review of security protocols for the town's historical assets. It was a title so profoundly dull that no one would suspect it of concealing an actual purpose. Mrs. Tiller, Canon Throop, Mr. Finch and Major Pym all attended. They sat around the large mahogany table like members of a particularly grim jury. Pubright, assisted by a silent, note-taking Sergeant Love, began the proceedings with a few placid remarks about the community's shared responsibility. The recent regrettable incidents at the Abbey have highlighted certain vulnerabilities, he said, his tone that of a man discussing municipal drainage. And while the police investigation is ongoing, we must be proactive. Which brings me to my first point. In the course of our examination of the refectory, it was discovered that an item was not merely damaged, but is in fact missing. He paused, letting his words settle. I refer to the Oglethorpe trowel, which appears to have been removed from its locked display case. He looked directly at Mrs. Tiller as he said this. It was not an accusation, merely a contribution to the discussion. For a brief second, the chairwoman's formidable composure cracked. A faint flush rose on her neck. She had been robbed, and had failed to even notice. It was a lapse in her custodianship, a chink in the armour of her reputation. Missing, she said, her voice tight.
That's impossible. I hold the only key.
The lock was perfectly secure. Indeed, Pubright said amiably, which makes its disappearance all the more puzzling. It seems our culprit is not just a vandal, but a rather accomplished thief as well. Major Pym snorted. Standards of vigilance, that's what it is.
An inside job.
Told you so from the start. Canon Throop simply looked sadder, as if another small weight had been added to an already considerable burden. Pubright allowed the uncomfortable silence to linger for a moment before smoothly changing the subject. However, the main target was, of course, the Veil of St. Agnes, a truly magnificent work. He turned his mild gaze upon the archivist. "Mr. Finch, your lecture was a testament to its beauty. Your research must have been exhaustive." Alistair Finch, who had been trying to make himself as small as possible in his chair, blinked nervously.
I did my best, Inspector."
"It's a well-documented piece, oh, I'm sure," Pubright said. "And yet, a small historical curiosity occurred to me. In all your research into its pigments and piety, did you ever happen upon any questions regarding the window's provenance? Its history before it was gifted to the Abbey, I mean. The official account is that it was a donation from the Fitzwilliam family in the late 1880s, but the details leading up to that donation have always struck me as being a little
"Sparse." The question hung in the airless room, seemingly innocent, purely academic.
But it was aimed with the precision of the stone that had shattered the glass. It was not about the window, but about the story of the window. Alistair Finch froze. His hands, which had been fiddling with a pen, became still. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His scholarly mind, a repository of facts and dates, was suddenly paralyzed by a fact he knew he must not share. His eyes, wide with a kind of terrified appeal, darted instinctively towards the head of the table to his patroness, Mrs. Tiller. It was a fatal reflexive glance, and Pubright did not miss it. Mrs. Tiller did not move, but a profound glacial stillness settled over her. Her hands, resting on the table, clenched into fists. When she spoke, her voice was low and dangerously controlled. "I cannot see what possible relevance the window's origins have to a discussion about modern security alarms, Inspector. Its provenance is a matter of historical record and is considered impeccable." "Of course," Pubright said, his voice still placid. "Merely a point of interest for a layman." But the moment had passed. The connection had been made. The shared, panicked silence between the archivist and the chairwoman was louder than any confession. It was the unmistakable resonance of a shared, volatile secret. Canon Throop looked from one to the other, a dawning look of puzzlement and concern on his face. He had sensed the sudden, icy tension, though he did not understand its source. Pubright did not press the point. He had what he came for. He calmly steered the conversation back to the tedious practicalities of motion sensors and reinforced locks. The rest of the meeting passed in a haze of feigned interest, the real agenda having been concluded in that single, silent exchange. As they filed out of the room, the participants avoided each other's eyes.
"Pubright remained behind with Sergeant Love. Did you notice it, Love?"
he asked quietly. "Finch and Mrs. Tiller, sir?"
"Yes. He looked like a schoolboy about to be caned." "And she looked like the one holding the cane," Pubright finished.
"The story of that window is a lie."
"And it's a lie that they have been telling together for a very long time." Just as the meeting was about to dissolve into a collection of awkward departures, Inspector Pubright raised a hand.
"If I might trouble you for a few moments longer," he said, his tone suggesting a minor administrative point had been overlooked. "I believe it might be possible to resolve this entire matter now." A fresh wave of tension washed over the committee room. The participants, who had been halfway out of their seats, settled back down, their expressions ranging from the Major's impatient scowl to the Canon's worried curiosity. Mrs. Tiller remained rigid, her face a mask of cold fury. "This affair," Pubright began, walking slowly to the head of the table, "is not about a broken window or a faulty organ pipe. It is about history. Specifically, it is about a lie." He started, not with the crime, but with the letters to the Flaxborough Chronicle from 5 years earlier. He recounted the claim made by Mr. Jonathan Oglethorpe regarding his family's bequest and the Society's vehement public denial. "A minor local dispute, long forgotten by most," he said. "But some people, I find, have very long memories." Then we come to the trowel, a solid silver object of some value, yet its disappearance went unnoticed. Why, I believe it wasn't stolen for its monetary worth. It was taken as an act of symbolic repossession. It was the most famous item of the Oglethorpe bequest, and its removal was the first step in reclaiming a family's legacy. He let that sink in before turning his attention to the great lie itself. "For my own clarification," he said, looking at a point on the far wall, "I spent yesterday afternoon at the county archives, reviewing the Abbey's original deed of gift from 1887. The documentation is quite clear. The Veil of St. Agnes was never donated by the Fitzwilliam family. It was, in fact, the centrepiece of the original Oglethorpe bequest of 1882. Its provenance was deliberately falsified 5 years later by a town committee eager to flatter a more powerful local family, a falsehood that has been maintained ever since. The silence in the room was absolute. Pubright's quiet, factual statement had detonated with the force of a bomb.
"A falsehood," he continued, his gaze now sweeping across the table, "that Mr. Finch, as the town archivist, must have discovered years ago.
A truth that Mrs. Tiller, as the Society's chairwoman, must have instructed him to conceal in order to protect the window's prestige and the Society's reputation." Mrs. Tiller's knuckles were white where she gripped the table. "This is outrageous speculation, is it?" Pubright asked mildly. "Your research into the law of charitable trusts, Mr. Finch's into siege engines, the Major's into old maps. Everyone in this room has been studying, preparing for a conflict, but you were all on the wrong side. You were preparing to defend a lie or to attack what you thought was a simple act of vandalism. The true culprit, however, was trying to expose it." He looked from one to the other. "The culprit is, of course, Mr. Jonathan Oglethorpe. He shattered the window. But he is a man who lives in York. He would have needed help. He needed an accomplice on the inside. Someone with access, with knowledge, and most importantly, with a conscience." Purbright's eyes came to rest, gently but inexorably, on the trembling figure of Alistair Finch. "It was you, wasn't it, Mr. Finch?" The archivist stared, his face crumbling. Mrs. Tiller made a move to speak, but Pubright held up a hand. "Let me explain," the inspector said, his voice still calm, still reasonable. "Mr. Oglethorpe contacted you perhaps a year ago seeking information for his claim. You, the keeper of the town's records, confirmed his suspicions. You knew the truth, and the guilt of concealing it, of being complicit in a historical fraud, became too much for you to bear. So you and he devised a plan, not of vandalism, but of what you saw as symbolic justice. He connected the pieces one by one with dispassionate logic. You provided the technical knowledge. Your research into medieval engineering was not for your lecture, but to instruct Mr. Oglethorpe on how to build a simple but effective counterweight catapult, which could be set up on a public footpath, as the Major's maps would confirm was nearby, and fired with a timer, allowing him to be miles away when the window broke. The choice of a granite stone, which is not native to the area, was a deliberate ploy to mislead us. Mr. Oglethorpe brought it with him. The timing during your lecture, at the precise moment the window's image was on the screen, that was your own touch, wasn't it? A moment of profound and bitter irony, shattering the lie at the very moment you were being forced to perpetuate it. You also provided access.
On a previous evening, you let Mr. Oglethorpe into the Abbey. You had long ago made a copy of Mrs. Tiller's key to the display case, a simple matter for a man with daily access.
He removed the trowel. And on that same visit, you yourself, knowing the organ's intricate workings, placed the second stone. It was a message for the canon, wasn't it? A plea for him to see that the Abbey's spiritual integrity was being compromised by the historical lie it harboured. Alistair Finch finally broke. A dry sob escaped him. He slumped in his chair, his face in his hands.
"Yes," he whispered, the word barely audible.
"Yes, it's true.
All of it, the lie."
It was a weight.
I couldn't bear it any longer. We were only trying to
make them tell the truth. The confession, when it came, was one of exhaustion, not defiance. Mrs. Tiller sat in stunned, apoplectic silence, her authority destroyed, her reputation shattered more completely than any window. Canon Throop looked at Mr. Finch, and in his eyes there was not anger, but a deep and profound pity. The quiet, civilized war was over, and the casualties were reputation, prestige, and a carefully constructed lie that had held for over a century. There were no arrests in the dramatic sense of the word. Justice in Flaxborough, particularly when it involved respectable people, was more a matter of quiet administrative action than of clanging cell doors. Mr. Finch, having confessed, was escorted from the town hall by Sergeant Love with a sad decorum, as if he were being led away for failing a particularly difficult exam. He and Mr. Oglethorpe would later receive fines and suspended sentences in a brief, sparsely reported court appearance. Their crime, it was generally agreed, had been an excess of historical conscience, an ailment for which there was no straightforward legal remedy. The real consequences were, as always, social. A week later, a short, typed letter appeared on the notice board of the public library, announcing Mrs. Eugenia Tiller's immediate resignation from her post as chairwoman of the Historical Society, citing reasons of ill health. No one was impolite enough to question the diagnosis, though it was widely understood that the affliction was to her reputation, which had proven fatal. Her formidable presence vanished from the town's cultural landscape, leaving a void that was filled with surprising speed by a committee of considerably less dogmatic individuals. The Oglethorpe family, having been formally vindicated, behaved with magnanimity. The famous trowel was quietly returned, and in a small ceremony attended by the canon, was officially redonated to the Abbey. A new plaque was commissioned for the now repaired window, which was henceforth to be known as the Oglethorpe Vale. Canon Throop, who oversaw these arrangements with his usual gentle grace, found that the delicate partnership between church and society had become remarkably less delicate. He was, at last, the undisputed master of his own house. In the grapes, the story was chewed over for a fortnight until it was worn smooth of all interest. Major Pym held court one last time, declaring that the whole affair was a perfect example of what happened when civilians tried to take matters into their own hands without proper, disciplined procedure. Then the conversation moved on to the abysmal state of the town's cricket pitch, and the scandal was consigned to local memory. A month after the fateful lecture, Inspector Pubright sat at his desk. The autumn sunlight streamed through his window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. In front of him lay the final report on case file 3B47, vandalism theft, St. Michael's Abbey. He had reduced the entire tangled affair of lies, legacies and long-held grievances to a few neat, declarative paragraphs. Collaboration between subjects Finch and Oglethorpe. Motive appears to be the correction of a long-standing historical inaccuracy. Damage to property has been rectified. Sergeant Love entered with 2 cups of tea. "All wrapped up then, sir?" he asked. "Just about, Love," Pubright said, signing his name at the bottom of the last page. He placed the report into his out tray with an air of finality. "Still can't get over it," Love mused. "All that fuss. Catapult, a church organ, all to change a plaque." Pubright took a sip of his tea. He looked out the window at the peaceful, predictable rhythm of a Flaxborough afternoon. "People will go to extraordinary lengths to tidy up the past, Love," he said. "Sometimes it's more important to them than the present." He picked up the next file from his in-tray. It concerned a stolen garden gnome from a prize-winning allotment. He opened it, his expression one of mild professional interest. Business in Flaxborough had returned to usual.